Wow, these lights are very bright. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for coming to my talk, and thanks very much to John and Maxine and everyone at Web Directions for having me. I've had some difficulty in the past kind of summarizing what my talk is about in an elevator pitch, and Stephen just did actually a better job than I ever have. But we kind of just start to try and muddle through it. So the subject of my talk is kind of considering the web as a physical medium. I originally put this lecture and slide deck together for the Typo conference in Berlin a few months ago, and the theme of Typo this year was touch. And it had a lot of people talking about not just the jet lag, the concept of touching people with work and also dealing with physical work and physicality in work. And so when I was invited to speak, I kind of had some difficulty being like, well, I work on the web. I don't work with anything physical. I don't work with anything that is really tactile, that has physical constraints. And then I was thinking about it a little bit more and also doing some research into like the history of typography and printed matter and information, and realizing, yeah, no, actually, we completely do work in a physical medium. We have all kinds of physical constraints, and we talk about these all the time, but we're not completely used to dealing with them, or historically we haven't been dealing with them. Except maybe recently, as we move into mobile devices and as we deal with wireless networks, we have to think about some of these physical constraints of web design more and more. So that's really kind of what I want to talk about today. I have an unfortunate habit of using up every possible bit of my time, so I don't know if there'll be any time for questions, and in fact, I'm going to try and like breeze through some of these slides as best I can. But if I am correct that there is no time for questions, and you see me around the conference today or tomorrow, please totally walk up, say hello, and you know, I love to talk about this stuff. So first of all, there's a really good book by James Gleick called Information, a History, a Theory, a Flood, that I read a few years ago. And it's really all about the whole history of information, from the development of the first written language all the way through to the discovery of DNA and the whole history of encoding and the spread of information. And that's really been kind of influencing a lot of my thinking about designing web and information systems. And one of the first things that he covers in that book is the evolution of information going from person to person. Where, you know, if I'm standing here in a room trying to explain all of this to you, that's, you know, going to be information that can spread to anyone who can fit into this room and anyone who can physically travel to Sydney. But, you know, I won't necessarily be able to spread that to the entire world, and that we've had to develop technologies to work around that. I should have actually switched this slide to kind of make that segue, but it's one thing that kind of, I think is really kind of underscores the power of the web, is the fact that I had to travel quite a long way to get here. Like, this is my first time in Australia, and I'm very excited to be here, and it took like maybe 20 hours of time just on airplanes, plus all the other travel time just to get here to be able to give this talk here in this room. And the reason that the organizers were able to reach me to come and give this talk, and the reason why, you know, the information about this talk is online, the reason why we're all here together, is this technology that allows us to send information over vast distances, basically to any arbitrary point in the world, virtually instantaneously. And that's a pretty big transition from where we started out with information technology, which is books. These are Gutenberg Bibles. These are some of the, I think, the original specimens that were put together by Gutenberg in, I think, the 1500s. I should really have, you know, refreshed my memory of the history before I came here. Books were invented to make information portable, so that, you know, it isn't dependent on me to be standing here in this room telling you something. I can write it in a book, or these days put on a web page, make a screencast, and send it to anybody, and anyone who reads that is able to learn the information that I've set down in there. Initially, books were handwritten. They were portable, but they're very slow and expensive to produce, and that cost of information, that cost of transfer, restricted the information there to people who could afford books, either people who had the time to actually transcribe them or to, you know, receive the information from the other person, or certainly people who could afford the cost of these very expensive books. And Gutenberg and the movable type and the first iterations of the printing press were invented to make that process cheaper. And that's, I think there's a kind of a nice parallel there between that and the invention of the internet, that this is all a technology that's been invented to take something that we were already doing, of writing information down and, you know, including references, showing the connections between information. It's not, the internet was not, or the web is not doing anything that we weren't doing previously, but it does it more efficiently and more cheaply so that it can spread to more people. I love that this picture, by the way, has 2 Gutenberg Bibles on here, because that's kind of the point, is that because information can be reproduced and reproduced over again much more cheaply, it can spread to many more people. It's also really appropriate, I think, that these are Bibles, because that's kind of was the original forcing function of developing the printing press. It's reductive, but only a little reductive to say that printing was invented to make reproducing Bibles specifically more easily, because that was the people who were the original patrons or funders of spreading information, was the church wanting to get their word out to as many people as possible. So this is also a little bit reductive, but there's basically 2 kinds of Bibles. If you look at the history of early printing and the 2 kinds of things that were being printed, you have, on the one hand, lectern Bibles. And even after the invention of printing, you still have plenty of these. These are the very large folios, like the 2 Gutenberg Bibles on the previous slide. They're very big. They have lots of really ornate drop caps, lots of the ornamentation that you see on the top. And these are kind of the evolutionary descendant or successor to the original illuminated manuscripts. They have lots of supplementary information. They're very rich in information. They have tons of information contained in a single physical object, but they're not optimized for portability. They're supposed to just be a lot of information in a very small space. And they may as well be handwritten or hand illustrated. The fact that they're printed is just allows you to maybe put more stuff into them. And you contrast that with this object. This is the Gideon Bible that was in my hotel room before I gave this talk last time, about 6 months ago in Berlin. I thought about updating this slide because just about any hotel room that I've ever stayed in has one of these small Gideon Bibles. The hotel room I'm staying in here in Sydney, I asked actually my Typekit coworkers to see if they could find me photos of and have like a whole slide full of Gideon Bibles. And turns out they were all in the only city that does not routinely have Bibles in the room, which is Amsterdam for some reason. Yeah, I don't know. I'm very curious what's going on with that. But anyway, so we have this really nice contrast between these 2 kinds of Bibles. We have the lectern Bibles, which are very informationally rich, and the Gideon Bibles. If you've ever opened one of these things up, especially this one from Germany, which has 3 languages of the New Testament, they're very hard to read. The paper quality is very kind of flimsy, but because they are so cheap to produce, because they have fit so much information onto one page, because they've made these compromises within physical constraints, this object is very portable and can spread to every hotel room on the planet. And so the tension here is between these 2 concerns. We have fidelity, which is the ability to make something that is very informationally or visually rich, versus reach, the ability to make something that may have a lower quality of information, may have less information packed into the same object, but which can spread far and wide to as many people as possible, more people than could have been imagined when books were first invented. Continuing the theme of things that are reductive but interesting, this is kind of a rough progression of printing technology over the years. And you kind of go from movable type, which is only text. You just have the ability to set type on a page and reproduce it over and over again. And then as we move into more advanced printing technologies, we have the ability to add illustrations and reproduce information other than just text. And then we start to get into lithography, the ability to include photography in our work, and then we have the introduction of color, and then digital technologies, which take the same thing that we were doing before with photographs and offset printing, and just simply take that same kind of printed matter and make it cheaper and easier to reproduce. And one thing that if you look at all this that's kind of interesting, to me at least, is that you have this thing that I call the photographic turn. And that is once you introduce the ability to reproduce a photograph, everything is effectively a photograph because it's easier. Like once you are putting a photograph of something on a page, it's just much simpler to just take a photograph of text and reproduce that and deal with things on sort of I forget what the thing is, but like the grains of a photograph, that's actually the word I was looking for, the individual grains, and dealing with things on sort of like a pixel level rather than actually setting a piece of type and having the ink represent the impression of a piece of type set on a page. Once you can do something photographically, it becomes a lot easier to do it photographically. And that kind of leads to what I call the apotheosis of printed technology. This is where we have reached. This is the apex of everything that we have printed over the years. The September issue of US Folk. And the September issue of, I don't know if this is true for Vogue in other countries such as Australia, but certainly in the US, it's kind of famous for its size and weight of this particular physical information object. This magazine is notoriously the biggest one that you can get. This is the September 2012 issue, which was current when I gave this talk for the first time. And as they proudly proclaim on the cover, it is 916 pages. The print edition of this weighs 4.5 pounds, which is 2 kilos. And Of those 916 pages, this is the thing I find really crazy, 650 of them, 71%, are advertisements. The actual usable content of this object is, I mean, unless you consider the ads to be content, which some people do, but let's say that they're not, that means that only 29% of this very large object is actual content that they're trying to produce as the magazine. And the other thing, the thing about this that's not on the slide that I really kind of want to impress is that because this is a digitally produced, it's produced using Adobe products, it's digitally produced, tons of photography, tons of digitally reproduced text and graphics. Every one of these 916 pages is a photograph, a color photograph that has been printed onto paper. For the sake of updating, I'll just kind of breeze through this, but this is, since it's now, we've passed another September, there is now the September 2013 issue of US Vogue. It's a little bit smaller, it's only 902 pages, although they are even more proud of that fact because it's much larger type at the bottom of the cover. And they've made it a little bit lighter. It's not actually percentage-wise, it's lighter than it really ought to be, so I think they're using cheaper paper and just printing these 902 color photographs onto thinner, cheaper paper. But the percentage of advertisements is even larger. So the usable content, the informational richness or value of this object has gotten even less, even as it has, gotten even bigger over the years. So just kind of to segue over to the web. So we've talked a little bit about print, let's talk about the web. And we talk an awful lot about bandwidth, we talk a lot about image sizing, especially as we get into responsive web design, we think a lot more about viewport width, image width, and all of these sorts of things. But historically, even though we build very beautiful web pages, we're not used to thinking of them as a physical object the same way that we think of books as physical objects. We spend a lot more time focused on this, which is the code. But as I sort of alluded to, there are lots of physical properties that we deal with when we create web pages. The first of which is, of course, dimensions. That's the one that I think we probably spend the most time dealing with. We have like the width of this page, which is 1090px. The type there is set at 32 pixels. There's a text size further down the page, which is a pretty conventional 16 pixels. We actually have to know the intrinsic size of web type so that we can do things relative to that if we need to. We have the square width of all of these images. We have the gutter width between these. We think about the dimensions of a web page all the time, even though we are usually specifying these things in code and sometimes get into some very complex informational relationships. We still ultimately have to deal with the fact that these are pixels being produced on a physical screen somewhere, and have to deal with things in a physical way in that sense. Web pages, of course, also have weight. We have all of the individual kilobyte weights of all the images on the page. We have the typekit embed code and CSS and JavaScript, and the one web font that's on this page altogether is 146 KB, which is actually for web fonts not a bad amount. There are lots of places that, or lots of font files you can get that are much more than that. We have all of the HTML document, the CSS, the JavaScript. If you take a look at all of this stuff together in the Web Inspector, even though this is a very simple web page, this is just the personal photography site of my boss Ryan Carver, the total weight of this page is almost a full megabyte for what is a fairly simply produced web page, which is kind of amazing. And then the flip side of this is that they're carried over networks that have limited bandwidth. In a purely informational world, if the digital world were as fast and ubiquitous as we kind of treat it as being sometimes, all of this should have no cost of transfer, and we should be able to send it instantaneously and free to any point on the earth, and we know obviously that that's not true. It takes 2 seconds to download all of this information into your web browser, plus all the time it may take your computer to decode it. And on mobile devices, the decoding time might be even larger because they have less powerful processors. So all that is to say this, as I said in the beginning, the web is a physical medium. This is not up for debate. There are definite physical properties and physical constraints that we have to consider in order to make web pages. So why don't we treat it like one? And I think this is the answer, is that for most of the history of the web, from 1993 straight on to the introduction of mobile devices, which I'll get to, this was the physical context, not only for producing web pages, which it still kind of is, but also for consuming them, which is a desktop computer. And when I say a desktop computer, I'm going to include laptops in there because especially for most of us who are not, unless you happen to have like a really tiny Ultrabook or what was the old term for a netbook, like one of those little 9 or 10-inch computers. Most of us are still, I think here in the room, I see a lot of 13 or 15-inch MacBook Pros or ThinkPads, computers that are still kind of fit the same physical form factor of a desktop PC. But certainly before we all had laptops, we definitely all had computers like this, and they had a few properties that really informed the conventions of web design. First of all, really past, I think, 1997, I don't remember when we all started getting the XGA or the 1024 monitors, but for as long as I can remember making web pages, we've all been able to count on 1024 by 768 resolution on the screen. The size of the monitor is usually such that it would be about 110 ppi. That's a number that until you get into Retina displays, you're not used to even thinking about what's the pixels per inch, what's the actual display density of a monitor. But now that some devices have Retina screens, we have to really think about this. What's the coarseness of the display? What's the actual quality of reproduction on the display? And of course, millions of colors. We don't have to think about limiting colors unless we're making an animated GIF, because we're so used to devices that can reproduce an infinite number of colors, we just do it. We just let the computer handle it. Another thing to kind of consider is keyboard and mouse interaction. This is not something I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about, but it is something that's different as we move into the mobile age, is that we don't just think about what are the things that you can click on, what are the things you can interact with the keyboard. We have to think of new modes of interaction. The hardware is desktop class that we're used to dealing with. There's a lot of things that we're used to doing with JavaScript in order to get web pages to behave the way that we want them to, that are actually a bad idea if the web page needs to be mobile compatible, because mobile devices are simply not great at doing JavaScript yet. They're getting better all the time, but the speed is I think an order of magnitude or several orders of magnitude different. And then finally, broadband internet. We're used to being able to transmit a lot of this stuff very quickly, so that even if you have a heavy web page like that almost 1 megabyte photo site of Ryan's, that'll be able to get to its destination very quickly, which is not necessarily true when you're talking about a wireless device. So this is kind of the sequel to the slide I showed you earlier about the progression of printing technologies, and this is kind of where I see some parallels between the two. We started from the original spec of HTML in the first web pages, where we had only text and hyperlinks. There were a few typographic things that were built into the web, but you had no control over this stuff. You simply had to take the web as it was given to you. And then as we get into the Netscape era, we have pages like Hotwired and some of the first examples of web design where there were very, very few affordances for designing a web page. We had tables, we had the font tag. Who here ever worked with tables and font tags? Quite a few hands, all right. That was a pretty dark time, right? But I mean, compared to right now, it's a pretty dark time. Compared to the time before that, I remember making my first web pages around the time that this stuff was coming out and thinking, this is awesome. It is so amazing to be able to center text. I was just thinking, I can't center text, and now I can do it. And let alone being able to make an image map or set things in a font besides the Times or whatever was the default on the computer. So this was a big leap forward, but it wasn't quite the same as going to what I consider the web's photographic turn, which is image maps in Flash. And I won't dwell on this too much because I think we all want to move past this as in our lives as quickly as we can. This is actually a screenshot of a website that I kind of wanted to put up in full size, but I have a lot of stuff to get through. It's the website for a restaurant that I go to in Chicago called Belly Shack. And this was a restaurant that I think opened no later than 2010, maybe 2011. It's a very recent restaurant. And their website is a full screen Flash animation that plays music as soon as you enter the page. And there's all kinds of crazy rollover animation. And it's just it's an experience that I'm sure someone spent a lot of time working with, probably an Adobe product. So I have a certain amount of appreciation for them as a customer. But still, I want them to get out of my way so I can find out what sandwiches are being served today. This kind of it's very informationally rich. It's this kind of thing that you would expect to find in the pulpit Bible of modern technology, which is the desktop PC, but it's not very informationally friendly at all. It's beauty at the expense of transmission. And then web standards. This, I think, could be a controversial statement, but the way we've approached web standards, I think, is great. We've gotten a lot of We've improved the informational quality of the web. We've certainly improved the consistency of how web pages are reproduced across different kinds of machines. But ultimately, our goals are the same. We're trying to make the same kinds of web pages we always have, but we're just using better tools to do it. So the conventions of web design continue to be informed by print. I actually really screwed up this build, so I'll just go ahead to it. We have the fixed page width and grid at 960px. This is something that responsive web design is really kind of just breaking in a lot of people. We just are not assuming as much that the 960 or the 1024 window is what we have to deal with. But because for so long that 1024 by 768 screen resolution was just what everyone had as a minimum, there are still a lot of web pages being produced that just assume if you do 960 wide, it will always work, which is obviously not true on an iPhone, but it's true on desktop PCs even now. And then also, this is maybe a little bit more egregious, is the use of images for type and wayfinding. We have better ways of doing this, which I'll explain a little later in the talk. But so I chose Vogue.com because obviously my example of the apotheosis of print was the September issue of the printed Vogue. Vogue.com is actually a very well-produced website. If you look at the code, it's got a lot of it's not super clean code. It's not minimal in any respect, but it is a great example of conventional design. The people working on this are definitely informed with web standards. They're doing things the right way. It's just that the right way has been a little bit janky, especially if you want to try and support as many browsers as possible. So we have a lot of images here being used for type instead of web type, or just simply using the fonts available on the machine, which leads to things like all this navigation is not very usable by a screen reader. It's not very usable by anyone except for the user and maybe Google, but we'll see about that. And another thing that I don't always do this with web pages, and I think I'm going to start because it's kind of a good exercise. If you kind of take the entire screenshot, the full height of this, one thing that you see when you zoom out from this page quite a bit is just how much it resembles a printed object. This looks like something that was put together in Photoshop and you're just scrolling down it. In fact, if you told me that someone had made a static image of this that just happened to have selectable text and just made this, I think this is like 3,000 pixels high by 960 wide, it's incredible how much this looks like something you just designed in a visual tool and just put out onto the web page. And there's not really anything wrong with that. I mean, this is a very good looking page. It's very easy to navigate. But it's not necessarily designed around flexibility or quality of information. It's designed as a single holistic piece on a medium that is now very diverse. So kind of how things have changed. This is a picture. The provenance of these two photos is a little bit sketchy, so I'll explain kind of what they're supposed to represent. I don't know exactly how valid they are, but this is a before picture of that's supposed to be from the time of the coronation of the last pope, when Pope Benedict originally took the papacy back in 2005. And the second photo is, again, I think this is verifiably from the ascendance of Pope, I'm sorry, I can't remember the current pope's name, Pope Francis? I think so. I will double check that and get back to you. Anyway, in just a few short years, everyone has a smartphone. Everyone has a device that not only is capable of taking pictures and video, which is what these people are doing, but also of reading the web. This is only about 6 years ago, and it's such an obvious visual change. And the first part of that is users are consuming their content on new kinds of screens. I mean, they've moved beyond the desktop PC. First, obviously, to notebooks, smartphones, 10-inch tablets. We have the iPhone class device. We have the iPad class device. I know many of you are probably Android fans, but I have no qualms about calling them an iPhone or iPad class device because those are still the market leaders. But beyond that, we also now have a second wave of these kinds of things. We have ebook readers that can read the web. I don't think the quality of web output on a e-ink Kindle or Nook or any other e-tablets that are out there is very good, but they can read the web, usually in a plain text form. We have the 7-inch tablets, like the Nexus 7. We have the iPad mini, now with Retina display, which is yet another Retina display we're going to have to deal with. We have the phablets, the phone-tablet hybrids, the like 5-inch tablets that a lot of people actually have. I'm surprised that people who are very devoted iOS developers have started saying they wish Apple would do a 5 or 6-inch iPhone because they really want the convenience of having a larger screen for reading and having that be the same device that makes their calls. And as people want to get into that even more, this is yet another class of screen we're routinely having to deal with. We have the convertibles. These are hybrid laptops and tablets, like the Microsoft Surface. And then we have this whole other set of things that people aren't targeting web content for TVs, gaming consoles, Google Glass as much, but these are also web-capable devices. And if these happen to pick up adoption, this is another place where our content might need to be, tailored. We have high DPI displays. This is something that's a little bit of, as web problems go, this is probably a bit of a first world problem. So it's not really a good thing to dwell on too much, but it is kind of interesting because we've been able to make certain assumptions about the just pixel quality of a web page. Like this is an example of, at the top, we have 24 pixel Source Sans Pro, web rendered, I think in WebKit, and on a 1X device. And there's a lot of pixels in there. It's not bad looking text, and especially if you're looking at it from the proper distance, it's going to look very good. And then we see how much clearer it can be when we double the pixels on a Retina display. So the quality of information and just the readability, the fact that you're not having to read around all of those anti-alias pixels is a very nice thing, but it comes at the cost of additional data being sent to the screen. And an interesting thing happens when you go high DPI, which is that they show existing artwork. They're completely compatible with the information and the web content that's out there. But if you have this first generation or the 1x photographs, especially something with a JPEG, where we've done all these really nice compression and rendering tricks in order to get things to look more smooth, once you double the pixels, all of those flaws came out. I think this is the first time I've given this talk on a screen with a projector good enough for you to really see the compression artifacts on the right-hand picture. And that's something that, it's not, you can decide for yourself how big a deal it is, or how big of a problem this is for you. But if you've got a lot of highly compressed images on your site, switching to a nicer quality of display will make your work look worse, which is something that we're going to have to deal with in the coming years. And the cost of making the change, the cost of switching to the 2x images, especially if the visual difference is not that much as it is here, it's, we're pushing 4 times the information, 4 times the pixels in order to get image quality equal to what we had before. And we're going to end up with much heavier web pages. And then we're going to be trying to push those web pages over wireless networks. The picture on the right is from Mumbai, and that was actually kind of, I take this as an example of a city that has lots of connectivity. As you can see, there are 4 cell phone towers just within the cropped section of this photo that I've got on here. And then we also have a cell and radio tower somewhere in rural Kenya. There are lots of places that do not have wireless access or where the wireless data access is very spotty. One thing that's kind of an assumption about wireless access that's kind of an inverse of what I would have expected is when you come to somewhere like Sydney or somewhere in Europe, and the 3G access is actually very, very good. I dare say that the 3G dongle that Maxine loaned me for the week while I'm here in Sydney has quality of access that is as good as the cable modem I have back in the US, because the US telecom companies are just really, really stingy with data speed. Then you also have, so you have places where in the US you can't count on the wireless access being as fast as your hardline access. Then you have places where you have no connectivity at all, and you can't make any assumptions about what a typical web user is going to have access to. So to kind of sum up, we are pushing more pixels to more devices in more places. We want the web to spread as far and wide as possible. We want the quality of our web content to be as good as possible. At the same time, we have new physical constraints. We're pushing this stuff over slower networks. The complexity of dealing with all this stuff makes these things harder to develop. You are kind of having to, at the far extreme, if you're used to dealing with web pages as simply printed work that you're pushing over networks, then you're basically having to make a full printed page or a full comp for every variation. And as we get to infinite variations of the web, that's just not going to be sustainable. And all of this, both the wireless networks are more expensive to operate and so more expensive to access, and the cost of the complexity of supporting all these different wireless devices means that the cost of development is higher, which is also not very sustainable. So to return to the theme, the web is a physical medium. It has all of these constraints. So what do we do about it? How do we alleviate these things and make better web pages for the future? The wrong thing for us to do, the thing that we should not do, is just get rid of images. This is a screenshot of, this is what adobe.com would look like if you took all of the images off of it. There are actually some things to like about this. This has a very nice simplicity and elegance that sometimes adobe.com lacks. No, I love my employers. Please don't fire me. But this is the stuff that's being hidden from here is actual information, images, audio, video, all of this rich media. This content, the ability to distribute this content over the web is one of the things the web does really, really well. So simply getting rid of it is not the solution. The solution is to maybe use them more judiciously. And at a kind of a higher level, it's to bear in mind that web pages, even those of us who are designers, who are simply trying to convey information in this medium and don't think of ourselves as software makers, the fact that we are working in the web makes software makers of all of us. And the more we can embrace the digital nature of the web platform and learn how to make better software, the better off we'll be. This is something that I think about quite a lot, which is what we deliver when we make web pages, or really any kind of digital information, we don't actually deliver the rendered work. We don't actually make a printed page and hand it off to someone. That's, what we do is kind of a metaphor, or that is kind of a metaphor for what we do, but it's not actually what we do. We deliver digital files and information that are instructions for rendering the work on a screen. This is true even if we're sending an image or a photograph. A photograph is just a list of pixel-level instructions for what color each dot should be on a certain pixel grid. So one of the ways we can make the web of the future even better is to simply start giving our devices better instructions and get better at giving those instructions. So there's kind of 4 things that I'm going to breeze through. This is going to be kind of a survey. I think some of the talks later in the conference will get into more detail on some of these. But at a very, very high level, scalable graphics, resolution-independent graphics, responsive web design, adaptive content, and more iterative workflows. I'll go through each of these in turn with the time that I have. So scalable graphics, this is something I think that a lot of us are on the same page with this already. That is, instead of using images for wayfinding and decoration and type, use other kinds of technology that are resolution independent so that we can simply use the same thing and have it work on any display regardless of pixel density or size. So CSS3 is probably the best example of this. We have the ability to do all of our border radius, all of our rounded corners on things in CSS, and that's now supported, I think, in every browser on the planet. That was the thing that, like, when people were first getting excited about CSS3, it's, OMG, we don't have to use images to do rounded corners anymore. It's such a small, insignificant detail, but it's something that a lot of people were very passionate about. And you can go beyond this to some stuff I'll show you in the next slide, to gradients, the drop shadows, even the ability to do magazine-style layouts with CSS regions was a technology that the web folks at Adobe have been working on. Lots of really great things you can do with just pure CSS. SVG support is getting a lot better. This is a technology that's been kind of on the fringe of the web for a really long time because it was inconvenient to use, and now browsers support it at about the same level as images or any other kind of asset, which is very exciting. And then finally, and this is my one shout out to what I do for a living at Typekit, web fonts. The fact that you can have very rich type without having to use images to do that is very, very powerful. This is the website for A Book Apart, which is a publisher. Well, maybe I'll just ask, who else is familiar with A Book Apart? Lots of people. Wonderful. OK, so they need no introduction. Or they're a publisher on the web. They're at abookapart.com. If you're not familiar with them, I recommend you do check them out. They are actually about to publish a really good book by, I'm friends with the people who run it, so I just got sent the PDF of their new SaaS book, which is really, really good. So I recommend checking out their website and checking out Dan Cederholm's SaaS book when it comes out. Anyway, so there are a few things going on here that are really cool. First of all, we have the outline here in blue. We have some really nice designed navigation and type and a button using only web typography in CSS. All of the fonts are web fonts. All the layout is being done. All the visual decoration is being done with CSS. There aren't no images have been harmed in the making of these elements on the page. We have SVG that's been used for the icon at the top and also the logo. These are SVG, so they're scalable and will work on any screen resolution. And then finally, we have SVG also used for the book covers at the bottom. There's only one image on this web page, which is this Just Enough Research hero image on the main unit. And it's not, I don't think it's actually a retina-friendly image. I don't think they've done anything special with this, but they've just ensured that most of the things on the page are as crisp as they can be on as many devices as possible, and the one image that's here works very well in context. So most of what we talk about with responsive web design, moving beyond that to talk about some responsive stuff, is we're used to the whole adapting to different screen sizes thing. This is Microsoft.com, a company that I think needs no introduction. And this is a site redesign that launched about a year ago that was put together by the folks at Paravel, which is a very nice responsive design agency in the US. And it works very well at a variety of different sizes. You can see that the Bing It On promotional unit moves into a different area on smaller devices instead of this like swiping dot navigation. You get arrows. You switch from horizontal to vertical nav. All kinds of really nice things going on here. I do not know how to pronounce the name of this website, and I'm not even going to try, but I check it out. I recommend checking it out. It's a very nice example of going to taking responsive relayout or reflow to a whole new level where there's like a really nice use of color. All the different like calendar and other informational units on the page do a very nice bit of content choreography. They shift into new positions, and every possible breakpoint, every possible version of this page is just delightful to look at. OK, so that's adapting to different screen sizes, and now I do know how to get my remote to work again. That's good. So the next thing is responsive images. This is something that partly because the technology for it is a little bit primitive. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about, but there's a lot of good work being done here. First of all, with responsive images, this is the website of James Duncan Davidson, who's a photographer in the US, and he was one of the first people to write about good techniques for delivering really crisp, high-quality photos to retina display devices, including iPads. And I think the current version of his site uses Squarespace, which has a lot of stuff built in for doing responsive images. This is this photograph of the RX1 from Sony. This photograph, I think, it will always serve up at 1.5x of the original screen resolution, so it's just sharp enough. It looks a little bit better on every kind of display, even if it's not fully retina. And there's lots of great techniques you can use that I don't have time to get into. But what I'm trying to get at is, like, you know, there are little simple things that you can do in order to make images look better, if not perfect, on all kinds of displays. Another good example is we have this site from Nokia that I actually just discovered the other day, where if you look at all of the big hero image photos throughout Nokia's website, you'll see that a lot of them will change resolution. Like if you are on a mobile device, you'll actually be sent a smaller image so that it takes up less bandwidth. And in some cases, the actual aspect ratio of the images will change in order to tailor themselves for the device that you're on. Responsive typography. Might need to kind of explain this slide just a little bit, but I think I can explain this slide, but the solution or the correction for this, I don't really have a good slide for, but I'll try and talk through it as best I can. So how many of you saw a lot of the early coverage of iOS 7 when it came out, and how the type size was too light, or the weight of the type was too light? Okay, so it was, what's going on here, this is kind of a demonstration of something that Apple got bitten by very shortly after I gave the first version of this talk, which is that if you are supporting non-retina devices, but you're, let me start this sentence over again. This is a complex thought, and again, jet lag. If you look on the right, the lightweight of Source Sans Pro, similar to the lightweight of Helvetica Neue, which is the typeface in iOS 7, it looks very nice. It looks a lot more clean and elegant than the regular weight. The regular weight, once you get onto a Retina display device, just looks chunky, and why would you use that many pixels when you could have type that looks much more elegant like this? But when you do light text on a non-Retina display, the extra pixelization actually makes it harder to read and makes everything look just messy. And this is something that only a few web designers had really tried to do, where you switch to all light text because it looks a lot better and has a nice visual texture, but it becomes harder to read on the non-Retina class of display. And then Apple came along and decided that that should be the default for all of iOS 7. They immediately got some negative feedback and switched to it. So this is something that I'll just go ahead and put up the slide for the blog post I put up on the subject a few months ago. If you go to this URL, this is a post that I did for the Typekit blog back in May, where there's a lot of suggestions in there for how you can alleviate that kind of thing, which is basically boils down to using media queries to target the right weight of type to each kind of device. So that this is another thing that you have to consider, or another thing that you can consider as you build high-quality experiences for multiple devices, is actually testing and looking at the different kinds or qualities of type and deciding like which weight is appropriate for which kind of device. Okay, so the next thing is adaptive content, and this is something I also have a URL to give you, which is going to have a lot more detail than I can provide, but to give you kind of a high-level summary of the kind of thing you can do, which is as you strategize and plan content to deliver all these devices, historically what we're used to doing is, like, especially in the case of a blog post or a news story, is you have a single canonical version, which is like the body text of the story, with maybe one summary, one headline, one byline, and just one piece of content that you're then pushing to all of your devices indiscriminately. And this may be the canonical version, the ideal version of the article, but one thing that a few news organizations have done, especially National Public Radio in the US, is go to a more robust form of content management, where in addition to just the basic body text, there's also all of these different bits of additional stuff, like a shorter summary, so that on the left-hand side we see the mobile version of the NPR website, where we see a summary version, like a two-sentence version of the entire story that you can view on the detail page. And then you can click through to get a much longer version if you want it. But if you're just trying to read through the news very quickly on a mobile device, the shorter version is actually quite appropriate. And then you have the ability to get more information when you want. And then on the left-hand side, where you have more room for oh, darn, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, you have more room for metadata. You have more room for contextual information. You have this caption on the image of Attorney General Holder that is not present in the mobile version. You have the caption around the media player. Actually, the media player itself, the link to the audio file of this radio story, because this is just the text version of a radio story. That's something that's not available on mobile. And if you look at NPR and other kinds of contexts, like the native app version, the native app will show the audio file and some of these additional captions, but will not show the main body text, which isn't really necessary. And then I just noticed something in my speaker notes that I just totally breezed past, so I'll just kind of go back to this real quick. The note that I made for myself here is that write once, run anywhere. Is that a phrase that, are people familiar with the whole concept of write once, run anywhere from the 90s that didn't work? Anyway, that's something that like people who were originally introducing Java were very excited about, the ability of writing a single piece of software that works in all kinds of devices. And that's actually one of the original goals or ideals of web standards, of being able to write one web page that looks the same in every browser. And we now know that that is always illusory. You always have to make little tailorings or adaptations for specific browsers or devices. And if that didn't work for software or for web standards, why would we expect for it to work for code? I'm sorry, for prose. Why would this work for any kind of writing? So this is actually kind of taking that whole like tailored content, tailored code into the world of other kinds of communication. The book recommendation I wanted to give is Content Strategy for Mobile from a Book Apart. It's by Karen McGrain, and there's it covers a lot of things to do with content management at the practical level, but also like just a framework for dealing with this kind of stuff and thinking about how to offer a more rich content experience. Finally, we need more iterative workflows. And I think this is people who've tried to get into responsive web design kind of find their way here, and it's something that a lot of people are still kind of struggling with what's the best way to do this. But when you're designing for touch devices or for any kind of mobile device, or really for any context other than the one you're looking at, which is your computer, it is very important to test. And in order to have something to test, you must build it. And so a lot of responsive design workflow is based around iterative cycles where you prototype something. You don't simply like make a sketch or a comp, but you actually build something that you can click on and use. You test it in as many of the important contexts that are important to you. That was repetitive. And then you repeat that process. You iterate and go through, and you don't simply build a single object to be released out into the world, but you iterate until it reaches a level of quality you're comfortable with. You release that, and then you go through in a very agile manner. I was going to try and put a few links to front-end frameworks on here, but I'll just sort of list a few of them. This is an article. If you look at the JMP, if you go to the URL in the upper right of the slide, that's an article on a list apart that describes one designer's process using, I think, the Foundation framework for making very simple responsive prototypes of sites that he's working on. A few other frameworks that work really well for this. Bootstrap actually has some good responsive stuff. I think there's Topcoat, which some folks at Adobe are working on. Any of these front-end frameworks actually do a really good job with making simple prototypes, where you can start from your paper sketch or whatever your favorite like pre-visualization technique is for web design, and then go immediately to functional code, where it doesn't have to be the best code, it doesn't have to be the thing that you actually ship to production, but it works well enough that you can click on it in a device and see how it feels. A really valuable tool for testing these designs is Browser Stack. This is if you are, if you're mainly concerned with how something looks, which you're going to be a lot of the time on brochure sites or corporate websites, just seeing a whole bunch of screenshots in something like Browser Stack on as many devices as possible can be a really valuable time saver instead of having to set up a whole device lab and test and take screenshots just to see what it looks like. But on the other hand, it is kind of important to remember that we're not simply designing in order to put, not always designing just to put our content onto as many screens as possible. That may be kind of like the first thing that we have to solve, but especially when dealing with things like readability. Like with like web typography or any kind of typography, it isn't simply how it looks on the screen, it's how does it feel to read it over a long period of time. And it's really best if you're making something to be read or something that you actually interact with to use it on as many devices as possible. So this can be very complicated, especially with Android, which has such a fragmented ecosystem. So it's like, it's good to start small, start as anywhere that you can, just get a few different kinds of devices. And when you have these prototypes or these early versions of your work, just scroll through them, click through them, test them on real devices as much as you can, even if that's not very much. Just try it on your phone and a tablet and a computer, and then add in like a different kind of Android device. Add in new devices as appropriate. If you hear that your users are using a certain kind of physical context or device that isn't necessarily how you've used it, see if you can find it in your budget to go get that device or a representative sample of that device, and just see how it feels to use things in as many contexts as possible. So to kind of sum up, this actually took less time than I thought, so I'll have some question time, I think. The web is a physical medium. It's not something that we're used to thinking about, especially with the web standards era, thinking so much about how to make the code cleaner, how to make the code more portable. We're not used to dealing, we've had to deal with all these physical constraints without really thinking about and dealing with them. And now that we have to deal with them, I think the future is going to be really exciting because we're going to get a lot of very diverse work. We're going to have a lot of very smart web design that works in a lot of different contexts and is, to boot, more sustainable and easier to work with. So, by embracing the digital nature of the web, making things more like software with better hinting instructions rather than just pixels on a screen, we can overcome these physical constraints, and the web of the future will be able to spread information to places we've never thought possible. And that is all I've got. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, David. So we've got time for some questions. So could we get the house lights up a little bit? Yeah, thank you. So if anybody has some questions for David? Yep.
Can you please go back to one of the first slides that you presented all of the different devices?
This one?
The one where you show that we have, in the beginning, desktop, watches, iPads,
yeah.
portable. Perfect.
Yeah.
So now we're actually creating a website that addresses all of the topics that you raised, all of the responsive issues, and everything makes sense and it's a fair game. However, in order for me to be able to achieve everything you mentioned, I need to be able to pinpoint what device you're using from those categories to access to cater to you. And obviously, you don't want to go on device detection because it's a never-ending story. You never know what device will come out tomorrow. And what you point is what many websites are currently doing, which using the pixels. However, new phones and new devices that are being released today have a pixel range that will not differ from my notebook. So my question to you, if you have any good ideas or pinpoints, how can I target and know which device the user is accessing when pixels is no longer a differentiating tool?
Well, I don't think that it's wrong to necessarily use pixels. It's one of the better signals we have available today. This is something that browser makers, I think, we run into this issue a lot at Typekit. We don't do a lot with responsive web design, but we do have to do a lot with device detection because each platform and each different type of browser takes a different web font format. And so we need to be able to identify not even like which browser you're in, but like which rendering mode IE is in order to determine like which font to serve. Which rendering mode might be, like depending on your rendering mode, we might need to serve you a WAF file versus an EOT file. So device detection is one signal that is not ideal, but which we've had to rely upon. So like, I guess my point in bringing that up is we've had to sort of live with the things that are suboptimal, knowing that we may have to switch them out for something better later, but we go with the information that we have. So if a lot of responsive stuff, pixels are really the best information that we have. And depending on the type of thing that you're building, it may be that you need to figure out like the relative size of the viewport compared to, say, a reference thing on the page. Like, for example, if you have an image or even like just some known constant thing on the page that you can figure out how much bigger is the viewport than the thing that you know about. That's one approach, but it's still ultimately going to come down to pixels until devices or browser makers can give us better signals. Feature detection is probably another thing to kind of bear in mind there, which is like you can get a lot of information with JavaScript out of the. I should probably like backtrack and say we do our device detection for Typekit with JavaScript, and I actually think that's even though that adds to the weight of the page and the execution time, it's probably one of the more accurate ways you can do responsive web design. Even if you don't use JavaScript for animation or anything, just being able to ask the browser what its capabilities are, ask it what its viewport width is, and be able to get some information about your context that way. That's kind of one of the better approaches that we have right now. Nothing is really ideal yet, but it's I'd say like just pixel detection, media queries, and JavaScript are the best things that we have until Apple and Google and Microsoft give us something better. All right. Anyone else? Any other questions? down in front.
Hi. Is that on? Yes. Do you think that more of web design will go further away from pixels and looking to efficiently use vector and how we design well with just lines and flat colors and more vector and almost avoid the need for most pixels at all? Because we're almost there, but apart from photography.
Yeah, it's sort of like asking like aesthetically, like the flat design stuff where it's using less. I think that's something that hasn't, a few people have talked about. So like there's kind of two things there, which is like there's the technology of the web, which is getting away from using, like trying to move towards using just simple lines and shapes because those are more scalable and easier to deliver to a lot of different devices. And then there's the aesthetic, which is a lot of UI design in general and web design in particular moving towards these flat UIs where there aren't as many drop shadows or gradients and just fewer things that require a lot of pixel gradation and just like simple shapes which can be represented well in a vector. And I think those two trends might be related because as people have had to support things on a lot of different devices and make things that are more adaptive, I think people are trying to get away from pixels, away from things that need to be generated in an app like Photoshop, to things where you can either just express the information more simply with a little bit of decoration, to things that are like literally scalable vectors like you talked about, like SVG support. There are a couple of just really, like a couple of browsers that if they would just either go away or start supporting SVG, not even browsers, I'm talking specific versions, like if not for IE8 and Android 2.3, we could all start using SVG today and make our web pages a lot lighter weight and more scalable. So I think that's something that's going to be a trend. We're not quite there yet, but if you were to ask again in 2014, I think that we would find a lot more use of just vectors and simple shapes on the web. Well, anyone else? Going once. Oh. All right.
So there's one more question.
Oh, there is? I'm sorry. Sorry, this is a very large room, and I'm not used to lifting my head that high.
Hello. It's good. Okay. I've been noticing there are several sites that tend to design vertically. For example, the less CSS site, and also, for example, the web directions site, where you have a navigation bar at the top, and basically it just scrolls you down. It's just one page. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on laying out vertically as a way of designing for different screen sizes.
I think that's actually that's a really interesting trend, and I was reading a really good blog post earlier today. That's kind of related to that by Trent Walton, because there's kind of like we've now reached a new phase of that. So the trend you're talking about is like the single page design, where like the web direction site. I've seen tons of these, and I can't call any of them mine, but that's, of course, a really good one, where you have all the information on a single page, you scroll through it, and then there's a navigation bar that follows you down the page until you get to a certain spot. And we haven't launched it yet. There's a new Typekit homepage coming out that follows the same kind of idea, and where you have everything on here. And I think one of the advantages to doing a web page that way that does tie into this stuff is that it's very simple and easy to make a responsive version of your entire site when you don't have to consider everything as like several different pages, all of which have to be made responsive and all of which have to follow a single template, but where you have a single scrolling experience where it all flexes and fits into the browser really well. So I think it's something that is just like, that's one thing I think designers have come to as a nice adaptation to responsive web design, where it's just, rather than have to think of a whole network of pages that are all responsive, you just have one experience that's responsive. And it's also really easy to navigate. You just get to scroll through everything with your thumb on a phone or a tablet, and it works really well. Now, the area where this might be going a little bit too far, and this is the blog post I read earlier by Trent Walton. I don't know the URL for the whole thing, but his website is trentwalton.com. He's a designer in Texas who actually worked on that Microsoft site that I showed. And there's a new trend. Apple has been really bad about this with the websites for the iPhone 5S and the iPad Air that was announced yesterday, the Mac Pro, where they do these very beautiful things where you are actually scrolling into different states or different full screen experiences, but the scroll is actually not following the natural scrolling behavior of the web page. It's not giving you the experience you would expect, but behaving a lot more like a very responsive and very well put together, but also kind of awkward slideshow. So I'd kind of recommend to I really like the single page approach to making a web page or making a responsive web page. I think it's something that's very easy for designers and very pleasing for users. I think there is an open question of whether it's possible to take that too far, and some of these Apple sites might be on the far side of that. So how that shakes out, how that form evolves over the next couple of years will be a very interesting thing to watch.
Please join me in thanking David Demaree for a very excellent presentation.
Thank you very much.